We're delighted to be joined today by Zanny Minton Beddoes, who is the editor-in-chief of The Economist. What would your audit look like on globalization? I mean, are we seeing the ebbing or the fracturing or the elimination of the globalization?
We're seeing the fracturing. We're seeing the fracturing. And I think this year, people will look back at 25 as being the year in which, the old world, if you will, was kind of fundamentally ended. The post-war order, there's all these kind of rather grand terms bandied around, but the world in which you had an America that cared about its allies, that saw itself as playing a benign hegemonic role globally, a world where you had multilateralism and rules. That world, I think, is going and largely gone, and we are in a much more fragmented, much more transactional, much more corrupt in its broadest sense, opportunistic world where might makes right, where rules are essentially ignored. And what we haven't yet seen is sort of what that world is going to end up looking like. And I think that's what we're going to start seeing the beginnings of next year, because it's geopolitically, economically, there are these tremendous fractures that have opened up. And at the same time, we've got this incredible technological revolution, that we're at the foothills of with AI. And so all of that has kind of, I think, shaken fundamentally what the old world was. And there's no going back to it. And I don't think we should want to go back to it. We're liberals, forward-looking. We're not kind of harking back to something that was. The question now is, can we build something, and what does that look like?
Well, let's look at 2025. And for me, we got a snapshot of an event, I think, which was very portentous, which was all those multi-billionaires sitting in the Capitol building, big tech, watching in semi-adoration the inauguration of President Trump. What went through your mind then?
Well, pretty much the same as yours. This is the glimmers of the new world. This is an unbelievably transactional, self-interested world where, money and influence and personal aggrandizement and, what matters, and you saw it then and you've seen it again and again in this world, what matters is, do you have the ear of the president? It's an extraordinary situation we're in right now, where the most important thing for any CEO in America is, do they know President Trump? Ideally, do they have his number on speed dial? And whether they want to do an M&A deal, whatever they want to do, that's the most important thing. That is amazing for a country that has built the world's most successful economy in part on, the rule of law. It's transformed in really just a year.
And what does that mean for media in America? Because you are a regular visitor and you spend a lot of time talking to people in that area.
I mean, I think it helps you understand a lot of what's gone on this year. And there's rightly been a lot of concern about, threats to independent media in the US. And to have even that conversations in the home of the First Amendment is quite something. But you have clearly an administration that does not, or you have a president who does not like criticism, who likes to, shape things and be in control. And you have an environment where he is clearly willing to use every tool at the government's disposal to punish critics, to, help people who, give money to his ballroom or whatever it is, and to gain personal interest. And that's the sort of environment we're in. What does it mean? It means if you are a company that has a lot of commercial interests outside media, but you happen to have some media, then you're going to start thinking about, will I be punished for things that are critical of the president? It means, of course, if you are, and particularly the TV companies, because of the regulatory requirements and the licenses they need, they're in a weaker position. I'm not in the camp that is worried about the sort of future of free speech and independent media in America. I think it's an enormous ecosystem. There's been some extremely excellent journalism, some very brave organizations. It's changing. The disruption that's happening in media is actually helpful because it's not a concentrated market by any means. But we're in a world where the president and the presidency does not believe in being held to account by a genuinely independent media. You see that with the way they're treating the White House press corps. You see it by all of the things. They don't like criticism.
I have to ask what you made of Steve Bannon, because there was one cutaway where you were sitting on a sofa and with an expression of sort of sheer disbelief on your face at one of his answers.
Well, he did say a few things. I mean, I was definitely biting my tongue. I think comparing President Trump to Moses was quite something. I have met Steve Bannon before. I actually did an interview with him on stage in 2018 as part of our 175th anniversary celebrations. We had an event in New York, and it was just after he left the White House, and there was a lot of kind of fuss around interviewing someone like that. And the New Yorker somewhat sort of disinvited him from a New Yorker event. And I remember there being a lot of criticism about why were we, quote, platforming someone like him. And I think I wrote a statement that was published about why I thought it was important to talk to people like him. And we had this conversation on stage. And I said this to him in this last interview, I was, very determined to show my kind of, liberal bona fides. And so I was interrupting quite a lot, asking, really sort of being an aggressive interviewer. And looking back on it, I'm not sure that we got as much out of that interview as we might have done, or I got as much out of it. And I wanted, and one of the things I want to do with these insider interviews is not, of course, to challenge and, of course, to ask tough questions, but also to have a conversation that is a genuine conversation that engages with people that we don't necessarily agree with at The Economist, but allows our viewers and listeners to understand where these people are coming from. Because and maybe it's sort of age or perhaps a slightly greater maturity on my part, but I think it's important, particularly in a polarized world like this, it's just important to engage with people who have a different worldview. And so someone like Bannon, he said a lot of things in that interview that, I mean, of course we challenged, and some of them were completely extraordinary things to say. But it's important that people know about it, I think. I mean, I believe this quite strongly because I think there's a risk that you sort of get stuck in echo chambers of like-minded people, and that is not going to be helpful.
I salute you for doing the interview. I think it was very important. I did do an interview with Steve Bannon around the same time and received 3 or 4 emails from Financial Times staff who challenged me about why I was doing this interview and essentially calling on me to deplatform, as it was called. So I wrote an actual essay in the Financial Times weekend explaining why interviewing people of different persuasion was important and the art of the interview and David Frost, etc. And I, like you, also thought that I didn't get as much as I should have done out of the interview. A couple of years later, Zanny, I got my true comeuppance because I was on a panel in Scotland where Steve Bannon turned up, and I was asked to give a review of the world in 2019 or whatever, and I did so. And I was followed by Steve Bannon, who said, "Well, you've had the cigarette, now for the cocaine."
I remember your essay, actually, and I remember reading it at that time and thinking that was, it was sort of extraordinary that you had to write an essay.
But that was part of the problem, and we'll perhaps should come to this, about some of the failings of what could be described as liberal-minded media, where people feel we shouldn't engage with these types, and we forget that we're journalists.
I completely agree. And I think actually it's in an environment, I mean, there are a lot of things in the last few years where, parts of the media have become so obsessed with, not platforming certain people and their own role and their own importance. And I think that we've lost sight of, particularly in the sort of woke era, we've lost sight of what it is that journalism, I think, is about. It's about shining a spotlight. It's about holding power to account. It's about engaging with people of different persuasions. And I'm genuine. I was baffled then, and I feel it even more strongly now that in a kind of polarized world that's changing as rapidly as ours is, it's hard for me to understand why it makes sense not to engage with people.
Well, let me ask you a related question, Zanny, which struck me looking back at what I thought were some of the more important stories in 2025. And one story was the way in which, and this came out in 3 books, again, I reviewed them, on the 2024 presidential campaign, where essentially the press, the media, was either co-opted or turned a blind eye to President Biden's enfeebleness and his state of health. And the second was I thought, very revealing story in the New York Times just couple of weeks ago about the way the Biden administration Biden himself had turned a blind eye, ignored policy recommendations to really tighten up on immigration and illegal immigration. And I wonder whether you think that the mainstream media in America, for whatever reason, undercovered these 2 very important stories, very important political stories, i.e. the health of the president and illegal immigration.
Yeah, the answer is clearly yes, absolutely. And I salute the Wall Street Journal, which came out, remember, and was quite a lot of controversy around it much earlier than anybody else with a piece about the president's health. We had our excellent Lexington columnist, James Bennett, wrote a column about why he should not run again. And we mentioned it in passing in a leader, but I look back now and think we should have gone bigger and much bigger earlier. I think there was clearly I don't think it was a conspiracy. I think there was a sort of general view of giving them the benefit of the doubt, driven by the fact that many people in the establishment media are sort of left-leaning, and the alternative seemed so awful. I think that's clearly true. And on immigration, ditto. I mean, I think there we did have a cover. We had a cover early last year that said that I think it called something like the issue that could lose Biden the election, or something like that. And I think it was very clear that it was a huge problem, and the Democratic Party was in entirely the wrong place. It's so beholden to its far left elements that it could not get control of the border. And doesn't make you a sort of an extremist to say that a country should have control of its borders. You can be a liberal and say that a country should have control of its borders. And there's certainly a lot of areas where the mainstream media was sort of incurious at best. Definitely. And I think that's what makes this moment so complicated, because, many of the things that the Trump administration points to, they sort of have half a point. They just, then usually what they go on to say, I fundamentally disagree with. But I do think, I think the whole sort of woke agenda, if you will, led parts of the United States into some very strange places.
And that's why, Zanny, in 2025, you saw a reorientation and a kind of tilt back, both Washington Post under pressure through the owner, Jeff Bezos, but also the changes at CBS News with Barry Weiss taking over.
Absolutely. But, the interesting thing is I think there's a sort of parallel development going on right now in Europe. And I'd actually be interesting. I can turn the tables on you and ask you about this. But in this week's issue of The Economist, you'll see that we have a lot of pieces about this. But I am struck that in his interview with me last week, Keir Starmer was extremely sort of strong about the threat posed, as he saw it, posed by Nigel Farage. I mean, he said something along the lines of, with a conservative government, I can sleep at night, but with a right-wing government, it's an existential challenge. Emmanuel Macron said similarly in 2024 that, I think he thought that there might be civil war if the far right, if the RN came to power. And in Germany, despite the fact and the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, is a more extreme party, but as it climbs in the polls, so there is a complete firewall. And, German newspapers will not interview the leaders of that party. I mean, they are completely beyond the pale. And I'm not sure that this approach of saying entire parties are beyond the pale, or simply saying, the reason for the mainstream is that it will be a catastrophic and existential crisis. This sort of, if these parties come to power, is either going to work or is enough of a an approach for the mainstream. And I think we're going to see something similar in Europe in the next few years, where how we deal with them.
We've got the opposite problem, and we've got the Reform has more or less got its own broadcasting channel, and two newspapers in the Mail and the Telegraph that are more or less backing reform now, aren't they?
But that makes it even, you're true, that's right. There, and the situation in Germany is very different to the situation in England. But here, do you think that an approach of saying it's, the sort of the end of politics as we know it will be a successful way of countering that?
No, and reform is completely different from the AfD. But I do think that Farage has his Trumpian tendencies and quite second-rate people around him. So I think people are right to feel worried about what he could do. But I completely agree that you have to engage with it.
So, Zanny, let me try and answer your question about firewalls and journalism. Do we treat these parties as pariahs? I think Germany has very specific circumstances because of the history of the Nazis. And some of people in the AfD definitely have, shall we say, Nazi tendencies. They play down the horror of the Nazi era, and they're sort of proto-fascist. That's not true of all of them. Others are pro-Russian. But the fact is that the AfD has a significant enjoys a significant percentage of support in the polls. It's not like the old NPD at sort of just under 5%, which was the threshold, by the way. I mean, if they're riding at 25, it seems to me that the firewall can't exist. Now, just on France, it's very interesting that Jordan Bardella now is seeking out, he's had an interview with the BBC this week, interview with the Daily Telegraph. I mean, he is really making a big effort to appear, or at least distance himself quite away from Jean Le Pen of the National Front, and cast himself as a plausible candidate. And in the absence of Macron having a designated successor, he's an important political figure, so I don't think the firewall works, Zanny.
Completely agree. As it happens, I went to see Jordan Bardella about 4 weeks ago with Sophie Pedder, our bureau chief, and he's very clearly a man preparing for power. But I then also went to Germany and I saw Alice Weidel, and I was struck by this because I'm my mum is German, I'm half German, so I totally, I completely agree with you that Germany has a very different and awful history, and so it is much trickier. I also think that the AfD, as you say, has some very, very, very unattractive and extreme elements to it. But I just can't see this working and lasting and being effective.
This interview was from the latest episode of Media Confidential, a podcast brought to you by Prospect Magazine. To listen to the full episode, click on the link below. And if you want full access to Prospect Magazine, go to prospectmagazine.co.uk.